The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the Italian marble floor of our penthouse dining room. Marcus didn't even flinch at the sound, his cold blue eyes fixed on mine as he repeated the words that had just destroyed my world. I want a divorce, Catherine. I've already retained Harrison and Associates. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 10 years. 10 years of marriage, and this was how it ended? With legal papers spread across our anniversary dinner table like confetti at a funeral. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd celebrated our first anniversary at this very table, drunk on cheap wine and cheaper dreams. Now Marcus sat across from me in his $15,000 suit, discussing asset division like we were business partners dissolving a failed venture. Why now? I whispered, my voice barely audible above the city noise filtering through our floor-to-ceiling windows. Marcus straightened his silk tie, a gesture I'd once found endearing but now recognized as his tell when he was about to deliver particularly devastating news. Let's just say I've outgrown this arrangement. My needs have evolved, his needs. As if our marriage had been nothing more than a convenience store for his emotional and physical requirements. I studied his face, searching for any trace of the man who'd once told me I was his everything, who'd promised we'd build an empire together. Instead, I found only calculation and something that looked disturbingly like relief. There's someone else, isn't there? The question escaped before I could stop it, though part of me already knew the answer. That's irrelevant to the proceedings. Marcus reached for the leather portfolio beside his plate. What matters now is handling this efficiently. I've prepared a settlement offer that I think you'll find generous. Generous. The word tasted bitter in my mouth as I watched him slide documents across the table. This was the same man who'd borrowed $50,000 from my trust fund to start his consulting firm 8 years ago. The same man who'd convinced me to co-sign loans, put my name on properties, and merge our financial lives so completely that I couldn't tell where his assets ended and mine began. I picked up the settlement papers with trembling fingers, scanning the legal jargon until the numbers swam before my eyes. The house, our house, would go to him. The vacation home in the Hamptons, the one I'd inherited from my grandmother, somehow listed as marital property to be divided. My vintage jewelry collection, the art we'd purchased together, even the small gallery downtown that I'd been quietly building for 3 years, everything had been cataloged and assigned values that seemed to favor his column significantly, more than mine. This can't be right, I said, flipping through page after page of calculations. The gallery alone is worth more than you're offering for my share of everything. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. Market values fluctuate, Catherine. Your little art project has been hemorrhaging money for months. I've been patient, but frankly, it's become a liability we can't afford to maintain. A liability. 3 years of carefully curating emerging artists, of building relationships with collectors, of turning what started as a passion project into something approaching profitability, all dismissed as a liability. The condescension in his voice was so thick I could practically taste it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I want to see the financial records, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, already compiled and reviewed by my accountants. He gestured dismissively at the stack of papers. Everything's there, properly assessed by certified appraisers. I think you'll find I've been more than fair considering... Considering what? Marcus paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. The pause stretched too long, filled with the kind of weighted silence that suggests unspoken truths hovering just beneath the surface. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. Considering that you haven't exactly been an equal partner in building our wealth, the accusation hung between us like a blade. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as I processed what he'd just implied. That my contributions, emotional, financial, social, had been somehow lesser. That the woman who'd supported his every business venture, who'd used her family connections to secure his first major contracts, who'd put her own career aspirations on hold to play the perfect corporate wife, hadn't earned her share. I set down the papers and really looked at my husband for what felt like the first time in years. The Marcus sitting across from me was immaculate as always, but there was something different in his posture. A confidence that bordered on smugness, as if he knew something I didn't. As if this conversation was going exactly according to some script I hadn't been given. "Who is she?" I asked again, this time with more steel in my voice. "Catherine, please. Let's keep this civilized." "Civilized?" I laughed, the sound harsh and brittle in the elegant space. "You're dismantling our marriage like it's a failed business merger, and you want civilized?" Marcus set down his utensils and folded his hands, adopting the patronizing tone he usually reserved for difficult clients. "Look, I understand you're emotional right now, but these things happen. People grow apart. What matters is handling the dissolution professionally, as if our decade together was nothing more than a corporate restructuring." I wondered how long he'd been planning this moment, how many evenings he'd sat across from me at this same table, calculating asset divisions while I shared my day or discussed weekend plans. "I'll need time to review this with my own attorney," I said, pushing the papers back toward him. Of course. Marcus's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Though I should mention that Harrison and Associates are quite thorough. They've already conducted preliminary investigations into all our joint holdings. I think you'll find their assessments are comprehensive. There was something in the way he said comprehensive that made my skin crawl. A suggestion that they'd discovered things I might prefer to keep private, though I couldn't imagine what. My life had been an open book to Marcus for 10 years, my finances transparent, my daily routines predictable. "What kind of investigations?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Marcus reached for his wine glass, taking a slow sip before responding. "Just standard due diligence. Tracing asset origins, verifying income sources, ensuring full disclosure." He paused, studying my face over the rim of his glass. "You understand, but I didn't understand, not really." The way he was looking at me suggested layers of meaning I wasn't grasping, implications that danced just beyond my comprehension. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, except I was beginning to suspect the missing pieces were deliberately hidden. My phone buzzed against the table. A text from my best friend Elena asking about dinner plans for the weekend. The normalcy of it felt surreal against the backdrop of my imploding marriage. How could I explain that the life we'd all envied, the penthouse, the successful husband, the glamorous social calendar, was apparently nothing more than an elaborate house of cards that Marcus had just finished dismantling? "I should call Elena back," I murmured, reaching for my phone. "Actually," Marcus said, his tone suddenly sharp, "I think it would be better if you avoided discussing our personal business with friends right now. For both our sakes." I froze, my hand hovering over the phone. "Excuse me? Just until things are settled?" Loose talk can complicate negotiations, and I'd hate for either of us to say something we might regret later. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I'd lived with Marcus long enough to recognize his negotiation tactics, the way he positioned suggestions as innocent advice, while making the consequences of non-compliance crystal clear. But this was different. This wasn't about closing a business deal or managing a difficult client. This was about controlling the narrative of our divorce, about isolating me from my support system before I could fully process what was happening. "Are you afraid I might tell them something specific?" I asked, watching his face for any telltale reactions. Marcus's expression remained perfectly neutral, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his wine glass. "I'm simply suggesting we handle this like adults, privately, professionally." There was that word again. Professional. As if applying corporate terminology to our personal destruction somehow made it more palatable, more civilized. But I was beginning to understand that Marcus's version of professionalism had very little to do with fairness or transparency. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to process the magnitude of what was happening. In the mirror, I looked exactly the same as I had 2 hours ago when I'd been getting ready for what I thought was our anniversary dinner. Same auburn hair pinned in an elegant chignon, same carefully applied makeup, same vintage Cartier necklace Marcus had given me for our 5th anniversary. But the woman staring back at me felt like a stranger. How had I missed the signs? Or had there been signs at all? I mentally reviewed the past few months, searching for clues I might have overlooked. Marcus had been working late more often, but his consulting firm was expanding internationally. He'd been distant during our social events, but he'd always been somewhat reserved in group settings. The changes had been so gradual, so easily explained away, that I'd dismissed my growing sense that something was shifting in our relationship. But now, with the clarity that comes from devastating revelation, I began to see patterns I'd previously ignored. The way he'd grown impatient with my gallery project, not just financially but emotionally, as if my passion for art was somehow embarrassing to him. The gradual decrease in physical affection, explained away by stress and busy schedules. The increasing frequency of business trips that never quite aligned with the client meetings he described. When I returned to the dining room, Marcus was on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. He ended the call quickly as I approached, but not before I caught a fragment of conversation that made my blood run cold. Everything's proceeding as planned. She's reviewing the papers now, as planned. The words echoed in my mind as I took my seat, suddenly seeing our anniversary dinner in an entirely new light. The expensive restaurant reservations canceled at the last minute due to a kitchen emergency. The intimate dinner at home that I'd initially found romantic, but now recognized as strategic. No witnesses, no public scene, complete control over the environment and timing. "Who is that?" I asked, though I suspected I wouldn't get a straight answer. "Just business." Marcus tucked his phone into his jacket pocket. "Where were we?" "You were explaining why you think I haven't been an equal partner in our marriage." Marcus had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable, but he recovered quickly. "Catherine, you know I didn't mean it that way. I simply meant that your contributions have been more supportive in nature." Supportive, another diminishing word in his growing vocabulary of dismissal. I thought about all the ways I'd been supportive over the years. The dinner parties where I'd charmed his clients while he closed deals worth millions. The charity boards I'd joined to expand our social network. The strategic friendships I'd cultivated with the wives of his business partners. The careful management of our public image while he focused on building his empire. "And the gallery?" I asked. "Was that supportive too?" Marcus shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. "The gallery was an indulgence, a hobby that got out of hand. Frankly, it's been a drain on our resources for years." A drain, an indulgence, a hobby. Each word was designed to minimize what I'd built, to reduce 3 years of hard work and growing success to nothing more than expensive entertainment. But I remembered the quarterly reports I'd shown him just 6 months ago, the steady increase in sales, the growing reputation among collectors. The gallery wasn't just profitable, it was becoming genuinely successful. "I'd like to see those financial records you mentioned," I said, my voice steady despite the growing suspicion coiling in my stomach. "Of course. I'll have my accountants forward everything to whatever attorney you choose." Marcus's smile was perfectly reasonable, perfectly accommodating. "Though I should warn you, the numbers might be disappointing. Small businesses often look more successful from the inside than they actually are." The condescension was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. This from the man who'd needed my trust fund to launch his own business, who'd spent years building his reputation on connections I'd provided through my family and social circle. The rewriting of history was so complete, so audacious, that I almost admired its thoroughness. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Elena, this one more insistent. "Call me. Something's wrong. I can feel it through the phone. David's being weird too." David, Elena's husband who worked in corporate law. The coincidence of 2 marriages experiencing simultaneous weirdness on the same evening felt increasingly unlikely. I looked up to find Marcus watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Everything all right?" he asked. but there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew the answer. Elena's concerned about something. Marcus nodded slowly, as if processing information he'd been expecting. David's a good man. Practical. I'm sure he's just trying to protect Elena from unnecessary drama. The way he said it, so knowing, so certain, made something click into place. This wasn't just about our marriage. There was a larger game being played, with rules I didn't understand, and players I was only beginning to identify. Marcus, I said carefully, how long have you been planning this? For the first time all evening, his composed facade cracked slightly. A brief flash of something, surprise perhaps, or annoyance at being caught off guard, crossed his features before the mask slipped back into place. I don't know what you mean. The papers are too detailed, too comprehensive for a recent decision. The asset valuations, the legal research, the timing. I gestured at the elaborate dinner setup, the careful staging of our anniversary turned execution. This took months of planning. Marcus set down his wineglass with deliberate precision. Catherine, I think you're reading too much into routine legal preparation. But I wasn't reading too much into anything anymore. I was finally starting to read enough. The man sitting across from me had spent months, maybe longer, systematically preparing to destroy our marriage while I'd been living in blissful ignorance. Every kiss goodnight, every shared breakfast, every casual conversation about weekend plans had been a performance, a carefully maintained facade while he orchestrated my downfall. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it was crystallizing into something sharper, more focused. Anger, yes, but also a kind of cold clarity I'd never experienced before. If Marcus wanted to play games with rules I didn't know, then it was time for me to start learning. I'll need those financial records by tomorrow, I said, standing and smoothing my dress. All of them. The gallery, our joint accounts, your business holdings, everything. Marcus remained seated, but I could see tension gathering in his shoulders. Catherine, I really think you should take some time to process this emotionally before making any rash. The only thing I need to process, I interrupted, is why my husband has been lying to me for months while planning to steal everything we've built together. The word steal hit its mark. Marcus's face flushed slightly, the first genuine emotional response I'd seen from him all evening. That's completely unfair. I'm offering you a generous settlement for a clean break. Most women in your situation would be grateful. Most women in your situation. The phrase revealed more about his mindset than he'd probably intended. I wasn't Catherine, his wife of 10 years, the woman who'd stood beside him through every challenge and triumph. I was just another woman in a situation, a problem to be managed and minimized. What situation is that, exactly? I asked, curious to hear how he'd categorized our marriage in his mind. Marcus stood as well, moving to the bar cart in the corner of the room. His movements were precise, controlled, but I caught the slight tremor in his hands as he poured himself another drink. A marriage that's run its course. It happens. To whom? He paused, the glass halfway to his lips. What do you mean? Who else is this happening to? You mentioned David earlier, and Elena seems to think something's wrong in their marriage too. Is this some kind of coordinated effort? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus took a long sip of his drink, using the time to compose his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. I think you're letting your imagination run away with you. But I wasn't imagining anything anymore. I was finally paying attention, and what I was seeing suggested that my marriage's destruction was part of something larger, more calculated than simple marital discord. The timing, the legal preparation, the coordinated responses, it all pointed to a plan that extended beyond just Marcus and me. I want to see Harrison and Associates' full client list, I said suddenly, the pieces clicking together in my mind. Marcus went very still. That's confidential information. Not if they're representing multiple parties in connected matters. Catherine, you're being paranoid. Am I? I moved closer, studying his face for tells. How many of our friends are getting divorce papers this week, Marcus? How many wives are sitting in their kitchens right now, trying to figure out how their marriages imploded simultaneously? Marcus set down his glass with enough force to make the crystal ring against the marble counter. For the first time all evening, his careful composure was truly cracking. "You don't understand what you're suggesting. Then explain it to me." The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths and hidden motivations. Outside our windows, the city glittered with its usual indifferent beauty, completely unaware that my world was reshaping itself in real time. Somewhere in that maze of lights, other women were probably having similar conversations, discovering that their lives had been built on foundations of sand. Marcus walked to the window, his back to me as he spoke. "Some opportunities require sacrifices." The admission was so quiet I almost missed it, but the words sent ice through my veins. Opportunities. Sacrifices. Our marriage had been sacrificed for Marcus's opportunities, whatever they were. "What opportunities?" I pressed, sensing weakness in his defenses for the first time. But Marcus was already rebuilding his walls, turning back to face me with renewed composure. "Nothing that concerns you anymore. We're getting divorced, Catherine. The reasons don't matter now, except they did matter. They mattered because understanding the why would help me navigate the what comes next. And despite the devastation of the evening's revelations, I was beginning to realize that what came next was entirely up to me. "I'll review the papers with my attorney," I said, gathering my purse from the side table. "But I won't be signing anything until I have a complete picture of our finances." "All of them? Where are you going?" Marcus asked as I headed toward the door. "To my sister's." It was the first destination that came to mind, though I realized as I said it that it was exactly where I needed to be. Sarah had always been the analytical one in our family, the one who saw patterns others missed. "Catherine, wait." Marcus's voice carried a note of genuine concern for the first time all evening. "Maybe we should discuss this more. Talk through the details." I paused at the door, looking back at the man I'd shared a life with for 10 years. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by his own revelations. The powerful, confident businessman I'd married was still there, but now I could see the calculating manipulator underneath. "The only thing we need to discuss is how quickly you can get me those financial records," I said. "All of them. Because if I find out you've hidden assets or manipulated valuations, the generous settlement you're offering will seem like a fond memory." Marcus started to respond, but I was already walking out, my heels clicking against the marble foyer with the sharp staccato rhythm of a woman who'd finally stopped trying to muffle her own footsteps. The elevator ride down to the parking garage gave me my first moment of true privacy since the evening's bombshell. In the mirrored walls, I watched myself transform from shocked victim to something harder, more determined. The woman who'd entered that elevator was the same one who'd been blindsided by divorce papers at her anniversary dinner. The woman who emerged was someone new entirely. Someone who'd finally stopped believing in fairy tales and started believing in evidence. My phone rang as I started my car. Elena's name on the display, her timing perfect as always. "Thank God," she said as soon as I answered. "I was about to drive over there." "Are you okay?" "No," I said, surprising myself with my honesty. "But I'm starting to figure out why." "David's asking for a divorce too," Elena said without preamble. "Same law firm, same cold presentation, same generous settlement offer that looks like garbage when you actually read it." The confirmation hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. 2 marriages, 2 law firms, 2 women discovering their lives had been systematically dismantled by the men they'd trusted most. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. "How many others?" I asked, pulling out of the parking garage and into the Manhattan night traffic. "I've been making calls. At least 4 others in our circle so far, all getting divorce papers this week, all represented by Harrison and Associates or their partner firms. 6 marriages, 6 women, all discovering simultaneously that their husbands had been planning their exits for months while maintaining perfect facades of domestic contentment. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. "Elena," I said, navigating through traffic toward Sarah's apartment in the Upper West Side. I think we need to meet. All of us. Tomorrow. Already arranged. My place, 10 a.m. Bring everything, papers, financials, anything that might help us figure out what's really going on. As I hung up and focused on driving, a strange calm settled over me. The shock was fading, replaced by something more useful. Purpose. Marcus had made a critical error in his calculation. He'd assumed that destroying my marriage would destroy me, that reducing me to most women in your situation would leave me helpless and grateful for his generous crumbs. Instead, he'd freed me from the obligation to protect him from myself. The city lights blurred past my windows as I drove toward my sister's apartment, toward answers, toward whatever came next. Behind me, Marcus was probably cleaning up our abandoned anniversary dinner, disposing of the crystal shards and pretending the evening had gone according to plan. He had no idea that the most important part of his plan, keeping me isolated and overwhelmed, had already failed. By tomorrow morning, 6 women would be comparing notes, sharing resources, and planning their own strategic responses. Marcus had taught me many things over 10 years of marriage. How to read people's motivations, how to identify leverage points in negotiations, how to plan several moves ahead in any complex situation. He'd just never considered that I might someday use those lessons against him. That was his second critical error. The first was underestimating. What happens when you back a woman into a corner and give her nothing left to lose? Sarah's apartment door opened before I could knock. My sister stood there in her pajamas and an oversized Columbia Law sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow still looked elegant. The expression on her face told me everything I needed to know. She'd been expecting this call for months. "I made coffee," she said simply, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "And I already pulled the files." "What files?" I asked, following her into the warmth of her living room. Sarah gestured toward her dining table, which was covered with manila folders, legal pads, and her laptop. "Every piece of financial documentation you've ever shared with me. Every casual comment about Marcus's business dealings. Every red flag I flagged but never mentioned because you seemed happy." I stared at the organized chaos spread across her table, suddenly understanding that my sister had been conducting her own quiet investigation into my marriage for years. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. "You knew," I said, sinking into one of her chairs. "I suspected." Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee, the ritual giving her time to choose her words carefully. Investment banker instincts. When someone's numbers don't add up, you start paying attention to patterns. She handed me a cup and opened the first folder. Inside were printouts of Marcus's business registration documents, loan applications, tax filings, documents I'd signed but never really examined. Seeing them laid out in chronological order told a story I'd never bothered to read. "His consulting firm," Sarah began, pointing to a series of incorporation papers, "has been restructured 6 times in the past 3 years. Each time, it gets more complex, more opaque. Shell companies within shell companies." I leaned forward, studying the documents. "That's normal for tax purposes, isn't it?" "To a point. But look at this." Sarah pulled out a bank statement I didn't recognize. "This account was opened 18 months ago. It's listed as a business expense account, but the transactions..." She ran her finger down a column of numbers. "These are personal expenses. Your gallery's operating costs, your art purchases, even your grocery bills. The implications hit me like ice water. He's been funneling our personal expenses through his business accounts, making them tax-deductible while simultaneously creating a paper trail that shows you as dependent on his business income rather than contributing your own assets." Sarah's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone confirming a long-held suspicion. "It's actually brilliant from an accounting perspective." I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands. The methodical nature of Marcus's deception was overwhelming. This wasn't a recent decision to divorce. It was years of financial positioning designed to minimize his exposure and maximize his control. "There's more," Sarah said gently. She opened another folder, this one containing photographs printed from what looked like surveillance footage. I hired a private investigator 3 months ago. Sarah, you didn't. I did. Her tone brooked no argument. Your husband has been having lunch meetings with Harrison and Associates for the better part of a year. Not recently, Catherine, a year. And not just him. She spread out the photographs like playing cards. Marcus at a restaurant table with 2 men in expensive suits. David, Elena's husband, at the same restaurant with the same men. 3 other men I recognized from our social circle, all photographed at various times over the past several months, all meeting with what were apparently divorce attorneys. A coordinated campaign? I whispered. The scope of the conspiracy finally becoming clear. Sarah nodded. 6 marriages, all dissolved simultaneously, all with pre-planned asset protection strategies. The question is why? My phone buzzed. A text from Elena. Emergency. Meeting moved to 8 a.m. Something big happening. I showed Sarah the message. She checked her watch. It was already past midnight. Get some sleep, she said, closing the folders. Tomorrow's going to be a very long day. But sleep was impossible. I lay on Sarah's guest room bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through years of memories that now looked completely different in context. Every business dinner where Marcus had guided conversations away from my gallery. Every social event where he'd positioned himself as the primary breadwinner. Every casual comment about my little art project that had slowly eroded my confidence in my own success. The manipulation had been so subtle, so incremental, that I'd internalized his narrative without even realizing it. I'd begun to see my gallery as a hobby rather than a business, my contributions as supplementary rather than substantial. Marcus had systematically rewritten our shared history until I'd forgotten my own value in the equation. At 7:30 a.m., Sarah and I arrived at Elena's Upper East Side townhouse to find we weren't the first. 2 women I recognized from our social circle were already there, both looking as shell-shocked as I felt. Elena met us at the door, her usual perfect composure replaced by something harder and more determined. Ladies, she said, ushering us into her living room. Welcome to the most expensive book club you'll never want to join. The living room had been transformed into a command center. Elena's dining table was covered with legal documents, financial statements, and laptops. A large whiteboard had been set up near the windows, already covered with names, dates, and connecting lines that looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Before we begin, Elena announced as the last 2 women arrived, I want everyone to understand that what we discuss here stays here. We're not just sharing personal information. We're potentially uncovering something that could destroy several careers and reputations. I looked around the room at the 5 other women. Miranda Hartwell, whose husband ran a hedge fund. Jessica Chen, married to a corporate attorney. Patricia Russo, whose husband was a real estate developer. Victoria Sterling, wife of a pharmaceutical executive. And Elena, whose husband David worked in mergers and acquisitions. 6 women, 6 successful husbands, 6 simultaneous divorces. The pattern was too precise to be coincidental. I'll start, Elena said, moving to the whiteboard. David's been planning this divorce for at least 14 months. His attorney bills show regular consultations with Harrison and Associates going back that far. But here's the interesting part. Those consultations weren't just about divorce strategy. She drew a circle on the board and wrote Meridian Holdings inside it. Anyone recognize that name? Elena asked. Jessica raised her hand tentatively. Robert mentioned something about Meridian a few months ago. A new investment opportunity. Same here, said Patricia. Frank's been very excited about some kind of partnership deal. Elena nodded grimly. Meridian Holdings is a private equity firm that's been quietly acquiring assets across multiple sectors. Real estate, pharmaceuticals, technology consulting, hedge fund management. She pointed to each of us as she spoke. All the sectors our husbands work in. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about divorce. It was about business. Our marriages were being dissolved to clear the way for our husbands' participation in something larger. But why? Miranda asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Why would they need to divorce us to join a business venture? Sarah, who had been quietly reviewing documents at the back of the room, cleared her throat. Because married men have different liability exposures than single men. In certain types of high-risk investments, particularly those involving offshore accounts or regulatory gray areas, being married can be a significant legal vulnerability. Are you saying they're divorcing us to commit financial crimes? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. I'm saying they're divorcing you to limit their exposure if their business ventures attract regulatory attention, Sarah corrected, which suggests those ventures might be operating in legally questionable territories. Elena turned back to the whiteboard and drew lines connecting each of our husbands' names to Meridian Holdings. The timeline supports this theory. The divorce consultations began shortly after Meridian started approaching them. The settlement offers are all structured to minimize our claims on their future earnings while ensuring we can't access their business records. I stood up and walked to the window, needing a moment to process the magnitude of what we were uncovering. Below, the city went about its normal Tuesday morning routine, completely unaware that 6 women were discovering their marriages had been sacrificed for their husbands' business ambitions. So, what do we do? I asked, turning back to the room. Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We do exactly what they're doing. We coordinate. For the next 3 hours, we shared everything. Financial records, legal documents, surveillance photos, recorded conversations. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the picture of systematic deception our husbands had orchestrated. The most damning revelation came from Jessica, who had discovered that her husband Robert had been moving assets to offshore accounts for over a year. He told me it was for tax purposes, she said, her voice hollow. I even signed some of the paperwork. Patricia had found similar offshore transfers in her husband's records. Miranda discovered that her husband's hedge fund had been restructured to exclude spousal claims on future earnings. Each woman's story added another thread to the web of financial manipulation our husbands had woven around us. By noon, we had a comprehensive understanding of their strategy. The divorces were designed to isolate us legally from whatever Meridian Holdings was planning, while ensuring we couldn't interfere with or benefit from their future success. The generous settlement offers were actually calculated to be less than our fair share of marital assets, but structured to seem generous by focusing on immediate cash payouts rather than long-term equity stakes. They underestimated us, Elena said, stepping back to survey the whiteboard covered in evidence. They assumed we'd be so overwhelmed by the emotional trauma that we wouldn't examine the financial details. Their second mistake, I added, thinking about Marcus's condescending explanations of my own business, was assuming we don't understand business ourselves. Sarah had been quiet for the past hour, working on her laptop while the rest of us shared stories. Now she looked up with an expression that was equal parts excitement and apprehension. Ladies, I think I found something. Something big. She turned her laptop around to show us a complex financial flowchart. I've been tracing the money trails through all of your husband's businesses. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the restructured partnerships, they all lead back to the same source. Meridian Holdings, Victoria said. Actually, no. Meridian is just another shell. The real money is coming from here. Sarah pointed to a name at the top of her flowchart. BlackRock International. They're a private military contractor that's been under investigation by 3 different federal agencies for the past 2 years. The room went dead silent. Private military contractor meant weapons, overseas conflicts, government contracts that operated in moral and legal gray areas. If our husbands were involved with a company under federal investigation, the implications were staggering. That's why they need to divorce us, Sarah continued. If BlackRock gets indicted, anyone with financial ties to them could face criminal charges. By divorcing you now, they're ensuring that you can't be compelled to testify against them as spouses, and they're protecting your personal assets from potential seizure. They're protecting us? Miranda sounded incredulous. No, I said, understanding flooding through me. They're protecting themselves. If we're divorced, we can't invoke spousal privilege to avoid testifying. But we also can't be considered co-conspirators in whatever they're planning. Elena walked to the window, her arms crossed as she processed this new information. So they sacrifice our marriages to protect themselves from criminal liability, but they also ensure we can be compelled to testify about anything we might know about their activities. The room erupted in angry voices as each woman realized how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. Not only were our husbands divorcing us for business reasons, they were positioning us to potentially take legal risks on their behalf while denying us any financial benefit from their ventures. "That's enough," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "We can be angry later. Right now, we need to be smart." I walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. "Elena, you said we should coordinate. I agree, but not just defensively. If our husbands think they can orchestrate our lives without our knowledge or consent, they're about to learn exactly how wrong they are." I drew a new circle on the board and wrote our names inside it. 6 women, each with skills and resources they've systematically underestimated. Sarah's a financial analyst who can trace money through any system. Elena has connections throughout the legal community. Jessica worked in corporate intelligence before her marriage. Patricia knows every real estate holding in the tri-state area. Miranda understands international finance better than most bankers. And I paused, thinking about the gallery Marcus had dismissed as a hobby. I know how to identify value where others see nothing. The room had gone quiet again, but this time the silence hummed with possibility rather than shock. "What are you proposing?" Elena asked. "I'm proposing we beat them at their own game," I said, setting down the marker. "They've spent months planning our downfall. I think it's time we started planning theirs." Sarah was already pulling up new files on her laptop. The federal investigation into BlackRock International. If we could provide additional evidence of their activities, we could ensure that our husbands' business ventures collapse before they can profit from them, Elena finished, her smile returning. "More than that," I added. "We could ensure that their divorce strategy backfires spectacularly. Because if they're criminally charged before the divorces are finalized, all their asset protection strategies become evidence of consciousness of guilt." Patricia had been quiet throughout most of our meeting, but now she spoke up. "My husband's been moving properties into new LLCs for the past year. I thought it was for tax purposes. But if they're actually hiding assets from federal investigators, then you have documentation of criminal activity that the FBI would very much like to see," Jessica said. "I still have contacts in corporate intelligence, people who would know how to present evidence to the right authorities." Victoria pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos. "I documented everything Frank brought home from his pharmaceutical meetings. I thought I was being a supportive wife, keeping records of his achievements. Turns out I've been creating an evidence file. One by one, each woman began to understand that their years of supportive behavior, the careful record-keeping, the social networking, the access to private information, had given them unprecedented insight into their husband's business activities. Activities that, if our theory was correct, were about to become the subject of federal criminal investigation. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "The timeline of the divorces. They're all scheduled to be finalized within the next 90 days, but BlackRock's current contracts don't expire until next year. That suggests something is happening soon, something that will require them to be legally separated from us." Elena walked back to the whiteboard and wrote 90 days in large letters. "Whatever they're planning with BlackRock, it's happening this spring, which means we have 90 days to stop it." "Not stop it," I corrected. "Expose it. Let them proceed with their plans, but ensure they face the consequences." The meeting continued until late afternoon, with each woman agreeing to specific tasks. Sarah would continue tracing financial records and identifying federal agencies that might be interested in our evidence. Elena would use her legal contacts to understand the implications of our husband's divorce strategy. Jessica would reach out to her intelligence contacts to verify our suspicions about BlackRock International. As we prepared to leave, Elena pulled me aside. "Catherine, are you sure about this? What you're proposing? It's not just divorce anymore. It's potentially sending our husbands to federal prison." I thought about Marcus's dismissive comments about my gallery, his systematic erosion of my self-worth, his careful positioning of me as a dependent rather than a partner. I thought about his smug confidence the night before, his assumption that I would be grateful for his generous crumbs. Elena, I said, gathering my purse. They made their choice when they decided to orchestrate our lives without our knowledge or consent. Now they get to live with the consequences of underestimating us. As I walked out into the evening air, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Have you decided on an attorney yet? I'd like to move forward quickly. I smiled, typing back. Still reviewing options. Take all the time you need. He had no idea that time was no longer on his side. The game had changed, and this time we were writing the rules. 3 weeks later, I sat in the back corner of a federal courthouse cafeteria, watching Special Agent Rebecca Morrison review the mountain of evidence we'd compiled. Across from me, Sarah maintained her professional composure, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes as Agent Morrison's eyebrows climbed higher with each document. Mrs. Blackwood, Agent Morrison said finally, closing the last folder. This is remarkable work. You've essentially handed us a roadmap to financial crimes we've been investigating for 18 months. The irony of using my maiden name for this meeting wasn't lost on me. In the past month, I'd reclaimed more than just my identity. I'd discovered capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed. The same attention to detail that made me successful in art curation had proven invaluable in documenting criminal conspiracy. What happens next? I asked, though part of me already knew from our previous conversations with federal prosecutors. Agent Morrison smiled grimly. Next, we execute warrants. All of them, simultaneously. Your husband's offices, homes, vehicles, safety deposit boxes. If they've hidden assets, we'll find them. If they've destroyed evidence, we'll recover it. Sarah leaned forward. And the timeline? Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. The coordination has to be perfect. 6 locations, multiple agencies. We can't risk any of them warning the others. I felt a cold thrill of anticipation mixed with something that might have been fear. For a month, this had been theoretical, gathering evidence, building cases, planning strategy. Tomorrow, it would become devastatingly real. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Dinner tonight? We should discuss finalizing the paperwork. The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, with federal agents closing in on his criminal enterprise, Marcus was still trying to control the narrative, still assuming I was the naive wife who would sign whatever he put in front of me. I typed back, of course. Our usual place? Agent Morrison was watching me with professional interest. Are you comfortable maintaining the facade for another 24 hours? Agent Morrison, I said, tucking my phone away. I've been maintaining a facade for 10 years. One more day won't be a problem. That evening, I met Marcus at Le Bernardin, the same restaurant where he'd proposed a decade earlier. The symmetry felt appropriate, beginning and ending our marriage in the same place, though neither of us had ended up being who we'd pretended to be back then. Marcus was already seated when I arrived, looking perfectly composed in his tailored suit. He stood to kiss my cheek, playing the part of the civilized, soon-to-be ex-husband. To any observer, we looked like two sophisticated people handling an unfortunate situation with admirable maturity. You look well, he said as I took my seat. I was worried this process might be taking a toll. I'm resilient, I replied, accepting the wine he'd already ordered. You taught me that. Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first hint that his assessment of my emotional state might be inaccurate. But Marcus had always been skilled at reading people, and he recovered quickly. I'm glad we can handle this like adults, he said, opening his briefcase. I have the final settlement documents. Once you sign these, we can file tomorrow and have everything finalized within 60 days. I accepted the papers, noting how his timeline had accelerated. A month ago, he'd been talking about taking time to process the emotional aspects. Now he was pushing for immediate finalization. The federal investigation must be closer to fruition than even we'd realized. 60 days seems rushed, I observed, scanning the documents. Are you sure we shouldn't take more time to ensure everything's properly valued? Marcus's smile was perfectly calibrated, patient but firm. Catherine, we've been over this. Extended negotiations will only cost us both money and legal fees. The terms are generous, I pretended to study the settlement while actually observing his body language. The slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the table, the micro-expressions that suggested barely controlled impatience. Marcus was under pressure, and that pressure was making him sloppy. "The gallery valuation," I said, pointing to a line item. "This seems low." "I told you, small businesses often overestimate their worth. The appraisal was done by certified professionals." "Which professionals?" The question clearly irritated him. "Does it matter?" "The number is what it is." But it did matter, because I'd learned from Sarah that the appraisal company was owned by one of BlackRock International's subsidiaries. They'd deliberately undervalued my gallery to minimize Marcus's liability in the settlement, but in doing so, they'd created a paper trail connecting our divorce to the larger criminal conspiracy. "I'd like to get a second opinion," I said casually. "Just to be thorough." Marcus set down his wine glass with enough force to make the crystal ring. "Catherine, I'm trying to be patient here, but we need to move forward. I have business obligations that require this matter to be resolved." "What kind of business obligations?" The question hung in the air between us. Marcus realized he'd revealed more than he'd intended, and I could see him calculating how to recover. But the damage was done. He'd essentially confirmed that our divorce was connected to his business activities. "Just standard corporate restructuring," he said finally. "Nothing that concerns you." "Everything that affects our shared assets concerns me," I replied. "Particularly if you're making business decisions that could impact my settlement." Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "Catherine, you don't understand the complexities of international business. These are sophisticated financial instruments that, try me." The challenge was quiet but unmistakable. For the first time in our relationship, I was refusing to be dismissed, refusing to accept his explanations without question. Marcus's face showed a flash of genuine surprise before the mask slipped back into place. "I don't think that's necessary," he said. "Carefully, I think it is." Closed the settlement documents and placed them on the table between us. "Because if you're making business decisions that could affect your future earning capacity, I need to understand what those decisions are before I agree to any settlement based on current valuations." The conversation continued for another hour, a careful dance of questions and evasions. Marcus grew increasingly frustrated as I refused to be mollified by his usual combination of condescension and charm. By the time we left the restaurant, I could see genuine worry in his eyes. As he walked me to my car, Marcus made one final attempt at control. "Catherine, I hope you understand that delaying this process won't benefit either of us. Sometimes the best thing to do is simply accept what's being offered and move on with your life." "Is that a threat?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far he was willing to push. "Of course not. Just advice from someone who cares about your well-being. Someone who cares about my well-being." The statement was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. This from the man who'd spent years systematically undermining my confidence and financial independence, who was now trying to divorce me to facilitate his participation in criminal activity. "Thank you for the advice," I said, getting into my car. "I'll certainly consider it." As I drove home, I reflected on how completely our dynamic had shifted. A month ago, Marcus's disappointment would have devastated me, would have sent me scrambling to repair whatever I'd done wrong. Now, his frustration was simply data, evidence that our plan was working, that the pressure was building in ways he couldn't control or predict. My phone rang as I pulled into the parking garage. Elena's voice was tight with excitement when I answered. "Emergency meeting. My place now. Something's happened." 30 minutes later, I was back in Elena's living room, but the atmosphere was completely different from our previous gatherings. Where before we'd been systematic and methodical, now there was an electric energy of barely contained triumph. "Ladies," Elena announced as soon as we were all assembled, "I have news. David came home drunk tonight. Very drunk. And very talkative." She pulled out her phone and set it on the coffee table. "I recorded everything." David's slurred voice filled the room through the phone's speaker. "The whole thing's falling apart, you know. The FBI's been asking questions about BlackRock, and now Morrison wants to move up the timeline. My blood went cold. Morrison, Agent Rebecca Morrison, who'd been coordinating our evidence gathering. Either there was another Morrison involved, or David somehow knew about our federal contacts. Elena caught my expression and shook her head. "Keep listening," David's voice continued. "Marcus thinks his wife's getting suspicious. Says she's asking too many questions about the business aspects. But it doesn't matter now. The contracts are signed, the money's already moving offshore." "What contracts?" Elena's voice on the recording, carefully neutral. "The BlackRock deal. Military equipment sales to Central Asia. Completely legal. But the profit margins are extraordinary. Once the divorces are finalized, we're all protected if Congress decides to hold hearings about arms sales." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with David drunkenly confessing to details about offshore accounts, weapons sales, and congressional lobbying efforts. But what struck me most was his casual mention of Marcus's concerns about my suspicions. Even drunk, they were monitoring our responses, analyzing our behavior for signs of resistance. "They know we're asking questions," I said when the recording ended. Sarah nodded grimly. "But they don't know how much we know or what we're doing with the information." Jessica, who had been quiet throughout the playback, suddenly spoke up. "There's something else. My contact at the FBI says there's been unusual activity in the federal databases. Someone's been running background checks on all of us." The room went silent as the implications sank in. Our husbands weren't just planning to divorce us. They were investigating us, trying to assess whether we posed a threat to their operations. "How extensive?" Elena asked. "Financial records, employment history, social connections. They're building profiles on us, probably trying to determine our capabilities and resources." I thought about Marcus's questions over the past month, seemingly casual inquiries about my daily activities, my friendships, my plans. What I'd interpreted as residual husbandly concern had actually been intelligence gathering. "They're scared," I realized aloud. "If they're investigating us, it means they think we might be capable of stopping them." Victoria, who had been reviewing documents on her laptop, looked up with a strange expression. "Catherine, there's something you need to see." She turned her screen toward me, showing a series of financial transfers from accounts I didn't recognize. "These are from your gallery's business account. Large transfers, made over the past 6 months, all to offshore entities connected to BlackRock." I stared at the screen in growing horror. "That's impossible. I never authorized those transfers." "No," Sarah said quietly, "but Marcus had signatory authority on your business accounts. Remember? You added him as a backup in case of emergency." The betrayal was staggering in its completeness. Marcus hadn't just been planning to divorce me and steal our shared assets. He'd been using my gallery as a vehicle for money laundering, connecting me directly to the criminal conspiracy whether I knew it or not. "They're setting us up," I said, the full scope of their plan finally becoming clear. "The divorces aren't just about protecting them. They're about making us the fall guys." Elena was already pulling up new files on her tablet. "That's why they need us divorced before the federal investigation concludes. If we're still married, we can't be compelled to testify against them. But if we're divorced and they can prove we had access to the accounts used for money laundering, we become the primary suspects," Jessica finished. "Scorned wives who manipulated our ex-husband's business accounts for revenge." The elegance of it was sickening. Our husbands weren't just abandoning us. They were positioning us to take the blame for their crimes. The generous settlement offers were actually hush money, designed to make us complicit in covering up activities we didn't even know we'd been involved in. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "I hope tonight's conversation helped clarify things. Looking forward to finalizing everything tomorrow." I showed the message to the group. Elena's expression was murderous. "What do we do?" Miranda asked, voicing what we were all thinking. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights while my mind raced through possibilities. Tomorrow morning, federal agents would execute warrants based on evidence we'd helped compile. But now we knew that our husbands were aware of potential surveillance, and had spent months positioning us as unwitting accomplices in their crimes. We accelerate the timeline, I said. Turning back to the group, Agent Morrison said the raids were scheduled for tomorrow morning. We need them to happen tonight. Sarah pulled out her secure phone, the one she'd been using to communicate with federal prosecutors. I'll make the call. But Catherine, once we do this, there's no going back. Our husbands will know we were involved. I thought about Marcus's smug confidence, his assumption that I was too naive to understand complex business arrangements. About years of subtle manipulation designed to make me doubt my own intelligence and capabilities. About the systematic way he'd positioned me to take the fall for crimes I'd never even known were being committed. Good, I said. I want them to know. The next few hours were a blur of coordinated chaos. Federal agents moved with military precision, executing simultaneous raids on 6 locations while we waited in a secure conference room at the FBI field office. Through secure feeds, we watched our husbands' worlds collapse in real time. Marcus's office was the first to fall. FBI agents seized computers, financial records, and 3 phones he'd tried to destroy when they breached the door. His face, when they placed him in handcuffs, showed genuine shock. The first authentic emotion I'd seen from him in years. David was arrested at home, still drunk from his previous evening's confessions. Patricia's husband, Frank, was caught at the airport, attempting to board a private jet to Switzerland with 2 suitcases full of cash and bearer bonds. By dawn, all 6 men were in federal custody, facing charges ranging from money laundering and weapons trafficking to racketeering and conspiracy. The offshore accounts had been frozen, the BlackRock contracts voided, and their carefully constructed plan lay in ruins. Agent Morrison entered our conference room carrying a box of coffee and wearing an expression of professional satisfaction. Ladies, I'm pleased to inform you that your cooperation has resulted in the largest international arms trafficking bust in FBI history. What happens now? Elena asked. Now you go home and get some sleep, Agent Morrison replied. There will be depositions, testimony, and eventually trials. But the immediate threat is over. As we prepared to leave, Agent Morrison pulled me aside. Mrs. Blackwood, I want you to know that your husband's attempt to frame you for money laundering was remarkably sophisticated. If you hadn't come forward with evidence, you might very well have faced federal charges yourself. The thought sent chills down my spine. Marcus hadn't just been planning to divorce me. He'd been planning to destroy me completely, to ensure I could never threaten his new life or business ventures. Will he be convicted? I asked. Agent Morrison's smile was grim. With the evidence you provided, along with what we seized today, he'll be lucky to see daylight before his 70th birthday. I walked out of the federal building into the early morning sunlight, breathing free air for what felt like the first time in months. My phone was buzzing constantly. Reporters, lawyers, friends who'd heard about the arrests on the morning news. But I ignored them all, focusing instead on the strange lightness I felt, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had suddenly been lifted. Elena caught up with me at the street corner. So what now? She asked. What do we do with the rest of our lives? I thought about my gallery, finally free from Marcus's interference and manipulation. About the artists I'd been supporting who would now have a champion unconstrained by hidden agendas. About the woman I'd been before I'd met Marcus, and the woman I might become now that I was free to remember who that was. Now, I said, hailing a taxi, we build something better from the pieces they left behind. 6 months later, I stood in the expanded space of my gallery, watching Elena cut the ribbon at the opening of our new legal aid clinic for women facing complex divorces. The 6 of us had used our settlements, significantly larger, once the federal asset forfeiture was complete, to create something none of our husbands could have imagined. Jessica's corporate intelligence firm now specialized in exposing white-collar crime. Patricia had become a real estate advocate for victims of financial fraud. Miranda was running a foundation that provided emergency funding for women escaping economically abusive marriages. Victoria had started a nonprofit focused on pharmaceutical transparency and ethics, and Sarah had taken a position with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, where her skills in tracing complex monetary schemes were being put to good use, protecting other potential victims. As for our husbands, Marcus received 25 years in federal prison. David got 20. The others received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, depending on their level of involvement in the conspiracy. None would be eligible for parole before their 70th birthdays. Their lawyer from Harrison and Associates was also indicted for conspiracy and racketeering. Their partnership was dissolved, their assets seized, their careers destroyed. The law firm that had orchestrated our systematic betrayal had become another casualty of their own ambitions. I never visited Marcus in prison, never responded to the letters his attorney forwarded. There was nothing left to say to the man who'd tried to destroy me to protect himself, who'd used my love and trust as weapons against me. Instead, I focused on building the life I'd been prevented from living for 10 years. The gallery flourished without the hidden pressures and manipulations Marcus had imposed. My art installations won awards, my curated exhibitions attracted international attention, and my business expanded into 3 additional locations. But more importantly, I'd rediscovered who I was when I wasn't trying to be who someone else needed me to be. The woman who'd been confident enough to start her own business, smart enough to build a successful career, and strong enough to survive the systematic destruction of everything she'd believed about her life. The revenge had been sweet, certainly, but the real victory was in reclaiming myself from the ruins of what I'd thought was love but had actually been the most sophisticated manipulation I'd ever encountered. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about becoming so successful that their absence becomes their own punishment, their loss becomes their own prison, and their betrayal becomes the foundation of your greatest triumph. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.